going to pause for a moment, let folks get tuned in. Okay. Welcome back to Sober Now. I'm Jim LaPierre. It's always a pleasure to be with you. Please, if you would, give a quick like for the video. And wanted to let you know that we're streaming live today on Sober Now's Facebook page. If you haven't been there yet, maybe slide on over there and give it a quick like. Lots of updates and cool things posted there. Coming along, streaming with our friends on choosehelp.com today. Always a pleasure to have you folks with us. And I want to ask you to take a moment and check out our YouTube channel. Almost 100 videos there now on topics relating directly to addiction recovery and mental health and trauma recovery. So a lot of free resources available to folks. Today we're going to be talking about dealing with obsessions and compulsions in recovery. And of course, I totally welcome your questions, your comments, your insights, anything that you have found that is helpful to you or anything that you'd like to get some more information about. Just comment into the Facebook posts on Sober Now's Facebook page, on Choose Help's Facebook page, or on my personal Facebook page, Jim LaPierre. So, the first thing we need to do in terms of exploring obsession and compulsion, there's a lot of misconceptions that folks tend to have about these. It's one more way in which what we see on television or what we see in movies kind of shapes our understanding, both about mental health, and for those of us without lived experience, it also shapes our ideas about substance use disorder and what the experience of someone who is in active addiction or early recovery looks like. And so those understandings are always limited and often flawed. Excellent resource. Surprisingly, if there's things about mental health that you're looking to understand more about and maybe looking for something that's layperson friendly, in my experience, Wikipedia is actually pretty fantastic for breaking down not just different diagnoses, but ideas around mental health and putting them in super layperson-friendly terms. So I really appreciate the folks that do that and just kind of point towards that as an ongoing resource for you. So the first thing we're gonna do is separate obsession and compulsion in mental health, and then we'll talk about it in terms of substance use disorder. So in terms of mental health, there's three main ways in which people experience obsessions and compulsions. Actually, let me define that real quick. An obsession is a thought that you truly do not want. Okay? So if you find yourself obsessing over that plate of brownies over there, or if you can't stop thinking about that new partner, that new girlfriend, boyfriend that you have, that's not obsession. That's something that you might be spending a little too much time on, or you might be coveting those brownies a little too hard, but it's not what we mean clinically when we talk about obsessions, okay? The second piece to obsession, my experience is that in almost all cases, when a person is thinking or behaving obsessively, they are avoiding. And that is kind of a counterintuitive aspect that took me a long time to understand. And if you think about it in terms of balance, it makes sense. When I am doing too much of anything, then by definition, I am doing too little of something else. And the real trick is to figure out what that is. Now, a compulsion is something that I truly do not want to do. In terms of something like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, the compulsion is most often irrational. So it's something that I feel I have to do even though it doesn't make any sense at all. So the classic example is the person has an obsession, which is a thought about going through a doorway, and their mental illness generates something like, I need to touch that door frame 6 times before I can walk through it. And the compulsion is the absolute need to fulfill that thought and actually engage in the behavior. Okay, so the first type of obsession compulsive behavior in mental health is anxiety. The second type, sadly, is psychosis, a person who lives with schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder with psychotic features. Those types of obsessions and compulsions are fundamentally different. That is most often a person who is experiencing auditory or visual hallucinations. They are hearing a voice in their head that's directing a course of action. That course of action is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, that the person should hurt themselves. People who live with psychosis certainly are very unstable when not medicated or in treatment, and I think we tend to fear folks who live with psychotic disorders, but in reality, in the overwhelming majority of cases, the person is not a threat to others. They are a threat to themselves, and that distinction matters. The third type of obsession and compulsion in mental health is what relates to trauma, and particularly for folks who live with post-traumatic stress disorder. In that case, we would not say that the thoughts are obsessive, even though they feel obsessive. The thoughts around PTSD tend to generate around intrusive thoughts. So an image or a thought that I truly do not want in my mind that is attached to my past trauma. The compulsion is most often avoiding triggers, avoiding things in my environment, and avoiding people or situations that cause me to feel unsafe. It's a lot, and unfortunately, the compulsion is most often fight or flight. The compulsion is an attempt to feel better, but there is almost always a loss of perspective, and there is a sense of urgency. When anxiety, especially anxiety that's attached to trauma, is overwhelming, typically we see people act very impulsively, and there's just this instinctual drive. Whatever I have to do to make this go away, I'm going to do it, whether that means sacrificing, whether that means compromising myself, whatever it is that I need to do to make this go away, I'm going to do, because this hurts too much, this makes me feel too afraid. What is very common, especially for people who live with post-traumatic stress, is to try to avoid the people, places, and things that trigger those feelings of anxiety, that trigger those thoughts or flashbacks or nightmares. And unfortunately, in most cases, that is quite literally an impossibility. There is always going to be something that reminds me of my past, and what's frustrating about that is it doesn't have to be rational. So to keep it simple, let's say that in the past I was attacked by a dog and it was a traumatic experience. I can go to great lengths in the here and now to avoid being around dogs, but what we most often find is that it's not just the experience or the dog itself. Anything that makes me feel today the way I felt then potentially compromises me, potentially triggers me. I've worked with folks who were largely socially isolated and were avoiding everything that they could possibly think of. They came to my office and just happened to smell the lilac bush that was blooming outside my office, or just happened to smell the freshly mowed grass, and it triggers a memory, and the next thing we know, there's a loss of perspective around what's happening in the here and now, and there's a flooding of emotion, and it really, in the end, most of these things become a losing battle with self, specifically around self-control. And I'm always urging folks to consider a few things there. The first is that we can have far greater self-control through self-acceptance than we could ever have by being overly critical of ourselves or being really controlling of our environments. Everything about fear makes us want to have greater control, and the thing that we fight the most with is ourselves. And so that losing battle is most often an attempt to not lean on other people, not draw support from others. I think we work very, very hard to maintain our composure and look like we're doing okay, even when we're kind of falling apart. And I don't want anybody to have that kind of pressure on themselves. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the next type of obsession and compulsion, but I'm going to pause real quick and just see if we have questions, if folks have weighed in. Bear with me just a moment. I'm an old person and my use of technology is not always the best, but we're going to get there. And there we are. Okay, so next type of obsessive compulsive piece that we're going to talk about is not about mental health at all. It's about substance use disorder. And quite often when I talk with folks, especially when they're in the first couple of years of recovery, there's oftentimes shame or guilt just around the fact that they find themselves thinking about drinking or drugging, the fact that they might find themselves having a craving. And I always want to correct that. I always quote my friend Artis. She was an old school addictions counselor who was brilliant, and she would say to folks, you know, there's nothing more natural than for an alcoholic to think about drinking. It is something that occurs without our permission. And it also underscores an important point, which is that anything that is happening internally, my thoughts, my feelings, my memories, those things ought not to be judged. They occur quite naturally. They occur without my permission. They are by definition not hurting anyone. They may be painful for me, but they should not be subjected to moral judgment. My actions, my statements, those can be judged, and in some cases should be. Is what I'm doing helpful? Is it honest? Is it in keeping with the relationships that I value? Sure, I'll judge those things, and ideally I'll be fair and judge myself in the same way that I judge others. So if you find yourself having that craving or that urge to use, that doesn't need to be judged. It does need to be cause for concern. It does need to be something that you act on, and it should not be something that you manage alone. I think, again, that's our biggest downfall. We're afraid to lean on others. We're afraid to admit that we're struggling or ask for help. And so we fight this losing battle, not just with ourselves, but with our disease. So the obsession is the thought that I want to use because I don't like what I'm feeling, because I don't like how I'm thinking, how my life is going. I want to use to block out memories. And then sometimes I want to use just because it's Tuesday. I want to use just because I would like an altered state of consciousness. I would like to feel better than I do right now. A dear friend of mine who's in recovery, we were talking about trading addictions, and she said, well, that's always a threat for me because I'm addicted to anything that makes me feel better than I did a minute ago, or potentially addicted. And I appreciated that. I see a lot of wisdom in that. So let's see. We're going to identify what the disease is telling us, what it is that the disease wants us to do, and then ideally we're going to share that with people who not only support us and encourage us, but also hold us accountable and hold our feet to the fire. If you're working with a substance abuse counselor or with a sponsor or a coach, I hope that you'll develop a treatment plan, not a treatment plan, a relapse prevention plan. Just kind of outline what are the things that most commonly trigger you to want to use or drink. What are the coping skills that you're going to use instead of using substances to cope? Who are the people that you're going to call on when you're struggling? What is the accountability that's in your life currently, and how are you using it? What is your ongoing plan that promotes your recovery, whether that's meetings or counseling or any number of other things that help you with that? Having that plan ahead of time is invaluable, because making that plan when you're already triggered or already experiencing the obsession to use is just absolutely devastating. If you find yourself just chronically experiencing those urges and that desire, if you have a higher power, I always urge folks to ask that craving be removed. In my experience, my higher power doesn't usually just take away problems. My higher power knows that if they did that, I'd just go out and create some new ones tomorrow. What most often happens is that the people and the situations that I need to overcome things, to heal from things, are placed in my path, and my job is to recognize them and to tolerate the awkwardness of reaching out, tolerate the vulnerability of expressing what it is that I need and feel. I just put out a vlog that you'll be seeing soon about how healing is awkward, and my experience is that is very true. As my friends in recovery say, you just have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and you'll be able to just grow and heal by leaps and bounds. And that is absolutely my experience. Of course, for an awful lot of us, if we are struggling with substance use disorder, there's almost 100% chance that we are struggling with past trauma, with mental health issues in general, with unhealthy patterns and relationships in our lives. And so the waters get kind of muddy from here. We are most often drawn to substances to numb the pain and the fear that we're feeling. We're still working hard to feel okay, to feel safe. I think first and foremost, really developing a commitment to self can look something like, I'm going to be okay as long as I don't drink or drug today. And then the challenge becomes, what do you add to that? Who do you add to that? And I think the more support we have, I mean, it's pretty clear. We tend to see a lot more success when folks are effectively using a support system. All right, checking those feeds real quick. Please let me know what your questions are, what you'd like to know about. Always love making these things interactive and getting a sense of what it is that folks want to know. Okay, folks are bashful today. Please fire away some questions or give me some insights. What's worked for you here? The next piece that I want to talk about is the value of simply taking pause. So when we find, whether it's struggling with cravings or struggling with a memory or a feeling that's been triggered, I think one of the most important things that we can possibly do is simply stop. I think that's hard for us. We're people who typically think and live at about 100 miles an hour, and it's not necessarily our intention to do that, but if I'm trying to avoid me, it's because I don't like how I feel, it's because I don't like where my life is at right now. I can easily live inside of here, which of course is insanity. This is not just a bad neighborhood, it's a warehouse for the production of really bad ideas. This is a place that complicates things, and specifically complicates them because when I'm thinking too much, I don't have a strong sense of how I feel. So I want to do a lot less thinking and a lot more action, and I don't want to be in this alone. Two heads are not twice as good as one. They're a million times better than one, and I urge you to keep that in mind in terms of whatever your recovery looks like, whether that's recovery from trauma, from mental health, from substance use disorder, or from all three. Take a quick break here. Hydration. As simple and as goofy as it may sound, big part of ensuring that we don't relapse is basic life need fulfillment, and specifically the use of Halt. If you're not familiar with it, Halt is hungry, angry, lonely, tired. It's another clever acronym Folks in 12-step programs recognize that most of us suffer with CRS, which is can't remember shit. So they invented acronyms and other cool tools that help us to remember things. So hungry, angry, lonely, tired is something that we can use two ways. We can use it as a preventative measure. I should never allow myself to get too hungry, too angry, too lonely, or too tired, because those things put me at risk, whether for relapse or other unhealthy behavior. I can also use it diagnostically. If I'm just feeling fucked up and I'm not sure why, I don't need to get inside my head and figure out why. In a very real sense, it doesn't help me to know why. It doesn't make me feel any better to know why. If anything, it makes me feel worse. So why am I feeling bad? Because I just had a memory of something really painful. Okay, now what? Now I think more about the memory. Now processing or thinking about that memory connects me to another memory. No. Why am I fucked up is not a really great question. How am I going to cope with this? How am I going to deal with this? That's a much better question. Okay, so Halt as diagnostic, I can keep it simple. Have I eaten? Am I angry? Am I lonely? Am I tired? And it's like so many things in recovery. I thought that was the simplest tool in the world. I thought it was incredibly effective. It is, and there's more to it. What I've learned over the many years I've been doing this work is that so much of what we hunger for isn't food. I've learned that anger never travels alone, and if I can identify the emotion that is being concealed or hidden by that anger, then I can get my needs met around that and ask for support. I've learned that I can feel lonely in a room full of people, or when I'm around people like my family of origin. There's all kinds of people there, but I still feel really alone. And I've learned that tired is the most common lie that I tell. In fact, I think it's the most common lie for most people in recovery. When I see somebody struggling, when I see that they're really down and I ask them, how you doing? They say, oh, I'm just tired. It's amazing how we use language to manipulate ourselves. Whenever you hear somebody in recovery use the word just, we never use it in a way that's just. We never use it in a way that is about justice or fairness. We use it as a way to minimize. And when we say that we're tired, what we usually mean is that we're impossibly drained. Nobody's pouring into our cup. We're doing way too much, and we're not allowing ourselves to have reciprocity. We're not allowing ourselves to ask for what it is that we most need. So ideally, I'm going to take better care of myself as I go. I'm going to maintain rigorous honesty, because in the absence of that, I'm going to be lost no matter what. I'm going to use a ton of accountability, because left to my own devices, nothing works. And a little bit at a time, I'm going to make sure that I have more safe people in my life, more safe places. And it's amazing to me that safety is the most important and most basic of all human needs. It's not something we talk very much about. In the course of addiction, everything feels unsafe. In the course of re-experiencing trauma, nothing feels safe. And in the midst of mental illness, everything feels distorted and hard. And the biggest distortion is how I perceive myself and how I experience my struggles. So I want to continue to grow spiritually. I want to continue to reach out and make the connections that my higher power wants me to make. It's funny, I was just saying this to someone near and dear to me this morning, that when I think about what I want or need, things get kind of complicated and fuzzy. But when I think about what it is that my higher power would have for me, I could simply ask myself, what does the universe want for me? What would the universe have me do right now? Things get really simple and really clear really fast. So those are just a few things that I suggest. I think, regardless of whether your struggle is a product of trauma, mental illness, or substance use disorder, or all of the above, I hope that you won't continue to struggle alone. I hope that you'll reach out to people who have lived experience. It always saddens me how often we reinvent the wheel and try to quote-unquote figure it out. I don't need to figure out anything. Figuring it out means being alone inside my head, and that's just never good for me. I can do brief periods of solitude. I can do brief periods of introspection, but anything beyond that just becomes isolation and me being really squirrely really fast. And that is not what my higher power wants for me. So I don't think very much in terms of what it is that I deserve. I think about what it is that the universe or my higher power wants for me. I think about how often we get stuck in the trap of being terminally unique, and I remind myself that it helps others to help me. I remind myself that I think I know that we have a tendency to project onto others and to decide that we're being an imposition or a burden. And if you're anything like me, those are lies that you tell yourself when you're afraid to reach out. And more importantly, it's part of what it means to be a good alcoholic. That expression is about self-centeredness in a way that is not intended to be selfish. When I decide that I shouldn't reach out to somebody else because they already have too much on their plate, I'm making a decision for them, which I never appreciate when people do that to me. And I'm coming from a place of feeling unworthy or undeserving, but what I'm really doing is allowing my fear and my disease to decide how things are going to be, instead of allowing my higher power or the people that support me to give me some input as to what it is that would be healthy for me to do next. So, going to be wrapping up pretty shortly. Again, want to ask you to connect with me. Jim@sobernow.com is the easiest way to do that. I love getting questions. I love getting suggestions or topics that you'd like to see covered in future live streams. Typically here every Thursday at noontime Eastern, talking about different aspects of recovery. Also want to really encourage you to check out the website, sobernow.com. 2 ongoing programs there. The first one is for folks who are seeking recovery from substance use disorder, and the second program is for affected others, those of us who have a loved one in active addiction or maybe early recovery, and ensuring that we're taking the best possible care of ourselves and educating ourselves about how addiction affects the entire family, not just the person with the substance use disorder. Please, again, give a like and share to this video so that we can expand the conversation and involve more folks. Please take excellent care of yourself. These are, of course, extremely trying times, and everything that we're going through with the pandemic, it can easily cause us to lose sight of the epidemics that are substance use disorders, alcoholism, opioid addiction, and the rising deadly combinations of fentanyl and methamphetamines, fentanyl and heroin. The relapse rates and the overdose rates are staggeringly high in our country, and I think that makes perfect sense in a time where things feel so uncertain and scary. So I think it's more important than ever that we take excellent care of ourselves and each other. I think it's more important than ever that folks make their recovery visible and accessible to others, and I hope that you share your experience, strength, and hope. And again, if you are struggling, if you need starting points in your recovery, if you have questions, reach out to me, Jim@sobernow.com. Take care. We'll talk next week.